I'm going to talk about a novel model of ensemble processing that I'm working on with Timothy Brady. Ensemble perception is a process by which we extract some statistical properties from a set of multiple items. So for instance, you might need to extract the average size from this set of circles. Ensemble processing of this type is fundamental because prior work suggests that it allows us to extract more robust representations, underlies our ability to categorize objects, and guide our attention. Given these properties of ensemble processing, we might want a quantitative model that gives some process-based understanding of how ensembles are extracted. Currently, there are several verbal theories or non-quantitative models of ensemble processing. Instead of summarizing these models, I'll highlight 3 relevant points of debate in the literature. As you'll see, these points of debate are related to one another, and each raises questions that we might want a model of ensemble processing to answer. The first dichotomy is between views that posit that processing of ensembles relates to processing of individual items versus views that assume that these are independent processes. The second dichotomy is between views that posit that ensemble processing involves computing averages over individual representations versus automatically extracting an average. And the last dichotomy is between views that posit that ensemble representations are probabilistic versus point estimates. Just to preview, the current model assumes that ensemble perception does relate to perception of individual items. It assumes a pooling over individual representations and a probabilistic type of representation. So in order to explain this model, I'll first need to describe the framework that motivated it. The motivating framework is a target confusability competition, or TCC model, which was conceived by Mark Shergin, John Wickstead, and Timothy Brady and published on in Nature Human Behavior. The TCC model combines 2 fundamental ideas to explain memory for individual items. The first idea is that memory representations are noisy, which is of course a basic principle of signal detection theory. So if you're asked to remember a purple square, you're not going to remember it perfectly, but there will be some probability distribution over how well you remember it. Likewise, because there's noise in the system, even items that you have not seen will elicit some familiarity signal. So your ability to discriminate between items that you saw from items that you haven't seen is captured by this parameter d prime, which reflects the average strength of each memory representation. The second fundamental idea is that familiarity of items in the environment are some function of their similarity to items that you have in memory. So for instance, if you're asked to remember the color of the square, the color purple is going to elicit a very strong familiarity signal, but colors that are somewhat similar to purple will also elicit a familiarity signal. More precisely, familiarity is a function of the psychophysical similarity of items in the external environment to items that you have in memory. Critically, these researchers combine these 2 fundamental ideas in a way that explains performance in virtually any memory task with this psychophysical similarity function and a single free parameter d prime. So next I'm going to describe how this model would explain performance in a visual working memory delayed estimation task and how it might explain performance in an ensemble task. To do this, I'm going to walk you through trials of both a visual working memory task and an ensemble task and compare predictions of the model for the 2. So imagine you have to remember 3 items in a visual working memory task. The TCC model predicts that each item is going to elicit some location-dependent pattern of activity. In particular, each item causes familiarity to increase for that color, but also similar colors. This pattern of activity for each item is corrupted by noise, and the signal-to-noise ratio is going to depend on factors that affect your ability to effectively upweight features of each item. So for instance, manipulations like set size and memory delay. When you're probed on an item, you query its location, and the TCC model assumes that people just report on the color channel that generates the maximum familiarity signal. So that's a model for individual items. What about ensembles? Like the model for individual items, we assume that each item elicits some pattern of activity over feature values, but critically we also assume that the distribution of activity of the ensemble representation reflects some of these patterns of activation for individual items, and that this pooling occurs at a relatively early perceptual stage of processing. It's before this distribution is corrupted by noise. And when people are probed on the average color, they just report on the channel that generates the maximum familiarity signal. So the critical point to note when thinking about the connection between the TCC model for individual items and for ensembles is that levels of activation for individual items, which are quantified with d prime in the visual working memory task, is what is summed in this early perceptual stage when computing an ensemble. This means that we should be able to formally link the 2 models just by estimating d prime from the visual working memory task and then using it to predict the pooled pattern of activation for an ensemble. To review, here's another representation of this model for ensembles. For simplicity, I'm going to refer to it as a sum model. And so again, the assumption here is that they're a pattern of activation for individual items, which are pooled at a relatively early perceptual stage to create this ensemble representation, which is subsequently corrupted by noise. So currently, outside of the TCC framework, there aren't any models that would allow us to predict performance on an ensemble task from a visual working memory task. However, we can do some model comparison by considering some logical alternatives. The first contending model is one that assumes that instead of summing over these patterns of activation relatively early, people do this at a later processing stage. So in particular, this individual items model assumes that people actually maintain location-dependent representations of each item in memory, and when they're probed, they calculate the average across these items. So the difference between the two models comes down to what stage of processing they assume the averaging happens. The sum model assumes it's relatively early. Another possibility is that instead of summing over representations of individual items, people just automatically extract an average. So this model assumes that people just extract a single probability distribution over the mean feature, which is also corrupted by noise. And the final model is not a TCC model, but it's a simple reference point. So this model just assumes that people automatically extract a noise-free point estimate of the mean. So next I'm going to show you a set of experiments where we compared these models. Each experiment is going to have the same structure. So in one block, people complete a visual working memory task, and another block, they complete an ensemble task. And as I've noted, we're going to use TCT prime estimates from the visual working memory data to predict the ensemble data. In the first two experiments, we're going to look at people's memory for color. Here I'll show you the data from the two experiments where we manipulated range in the ensemble task and set size. I'll begin by showing you the fit of the TCC model to the visual working memory data to demonstrate that these fits look reasonable. So this is the fit of the TCC model, which recall involves combining psychophysical similarity function with D prime. As you can see, these fits look reasonable. But what we're interested in is in the ability of this model to predict data on the ensemble task. So next I'm going to show you these model predictions just for one of the conditions first. So here are the predictions of the sum TCC model of data in the ensemble task, and the condition will range with 90 degrees. And the orange bars are the data, and the black line is the prediction of the sum model. So again, I want to emphasize that these are not model fits, but model predictions using D prime estimates from the visual working memory task. And here are predictions and other conditions. So I've shown you that the model makes good predictions for ensemble memory for color, and now we might want to know whether it also does well for ensemble memory for other features. So in these experiments, we looked at memory for shape. And here are the model fits and the model predictions. So again, in two experiments, we manipulated either the range or the set size. So I've shown visually how well the sum model predicts data in the ensemble task, and next I'll show you the results of the model comparison. As a reminder, here are small schematics of the sum model and the contending models, and I'm going to show you the predictive accuracy of each model in a bar graph. Each bar is going to represent the predictive accuracy for a given model using the color coding scheme shown here, and the measure of predictive accuracy is a predictive negative log likelihood, and smaller values are better. So these are the results across the 4 experiments. And there are error bars here, but they're small, so hard to see. So what matters are not the actual values, but the ordinal relationship between bars, and in particular which bar is the lowest. As you can see across all 4 experiments, the sum model has the highest predictive accuracy, meaning it's the best performing model. So far, we've demonstrated that prediction works well when we assume equal weighting of all items in memory. That is, we assume that on average, each item generates the same familiarity signal. But we might also want to know whether the model makes good predictions if we assume unequal weighting of items, because this would provide a stronger test of the view that people are actually summing these patterns of activation of individual items. We examined this question in the context of the sequential memory paradigm, because there's already quite a bit of work showing that there are strong recency effects in visual working memory tasks with sequential presentation. So in the visual working memory experiment, on each trial, people saw a sequence of color objects like this. At the end of the trial, they were probed on one of the items being asked to report on its color. And then in the ensemble task, people saw a sequence of the same object of different colors and were asked to report on the average color at the end of the trial. So one small difficulty is that if we present all colors randomly in the ensemble task, recency effects are going to wash out in the average. So we had to design the ensemble task in a way that would allow us to capture effects of recency on ensemble memory. And the way we did this is by controlling whether the three most recent items were on the right side or positive side of the mean, or the left or negative side of the mean. So the negative direction or the positive direction from the mean in color space. And so the prediction is that if there's higher weighting of more recent items, the average self-report should be biased in the direction of these last three items, so either positive or negative. So here are the fits of the model to the visual working memory data. As you can see, the fits look reasonable. Importantly, each item in the sequence has a different d prime, and there's a recency effect. And here are the data and prediction of the sequential TCC model. First, note that there is a predicted bias in these data. Furthermore, the unequal weighting TCC model that takes into account these different d primes of each item in the sequence captures a skew in the distribution. We can also compare it to an equal weighting model where we assume just a fixed d prime for all items, and the equal weighting model performs worse. And finally, in the model comparison, you can see that the sum model outperforms the other models. So together, this set of experiments demonstrate that the model can predict memory for ensembles across a range of feature spaces, and when we have equal and unequal weighting of items in memory. I discussed the novel model of ensemble processing. The TCC framework allows us to formally link a model of memory for individual items with a model for ensembles. And the model postulates probabilistic representations, meaning that it is broadly consistent with population coding models of memory. It is the first model that allows us to predict entire distributions of memory errors in a continuous report task. And finally, it's also the first model that allows us to predict ensemble data from visual working memory data, which is the strongest test of the model's ability to generalize across different task structures. Thank you.